Alright, we're going to eventually get this working here. Hang with me for a second. Alright, I got it. I'm Meg Graham. I'm going to talk to you today about the layers of the skin. So let's get started. There's three basic layers of the skin. You start with the epidermis, which is epi meaning upon or on, that tells you it's on the outside. So that is the epidermis. Everything above that is going to be epidermis. It's composed mainly of stratified squamous epithelium, and we'll talk about that in much detail in just a second. The second layer you have is the dermis, which goes from there to there on this particular slide. And the dermis is composed of dense, irregular connective tissue. It contains a lot of blood vessels and nerves, which we'll talk about all that in just a second. And then finally you have the hypodermis, or sometimes called subcutaneous layer. And so that's the one that's under the dermis, hypo being under. It's technically not a skin layer, but we're going to talk about it anyway. Let's move on to the next slide. Let's start with the first with the epidermis. As I said before, it's made of stratified squamous epithelium, and basically it's just a bunch of layers of dead cells. These cells are called keratinocytes, and these keratinocytes secrete a protein called keratin. Now, this keratin is a tough, fibrous protein, and it ends up forming a waxy, kind of waterproofing layer over our skin. It kind of forms a barrier so that things can't get out. We don't want to lose our water, and it also so things like bacteria and stuff can't get in. But think about it when you're snuggling with somebody. You're really snuggling up to dead on dead. So doesn't that make you want to go out and, well, we're not going to talk about that. Anyway, the next thing we want to know about epidermis is that it's avascular. So that just means that it doesn't have a blood supply. And you're going, well, how does it live if it doesn't have a blood supply? It doesn't. That's why it's dead. The blood supply at the very bottom of this layer, it can gain nutrients by diffusion from the underlying layer of the dermis. So the very bottom of this layer will have some live cells, but as you move up higher and higher away, it gets farther away from the blood source, and so it just starts to die. It's also keratinized. We talked about that already. It's thickest, the epidermis is thickest in areas where you have a lot of friction. So like on the soles of your feet, the palms of your hands, you're going to have a lot of thickness there. Your eyelids might be more thin, so you can have what we call thick and thin skin, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a little bit. But wherever there's friction, that's going to stimulate more mitosis of these cells, and so you'll get thicker layers there. It also contains a cell called the melanocyte, and these melanocytes produce melanin, and melanin is a pigment which actually gives skin its color. It protects the skin from the harmful UV rays from the sun, and when it makes this melanin, it actually sends the melanin out to the other cells like the keratinocytes that are surrounding it. So what happens is that leaves the melanocytes, the ones that produce the melanin, with no melanin. So they are vulnerable to the effects of UV radiation from the sun, and so you've probably heard of the skin cancer called melanoma. It's actually a very deadly skin cancer. That would be a cancer of these melanocytes, and the reason they are prone to get it is because they send their melanin out, and then that leaves them open to the harmful effects of the sun. The epidermis is actually composed of 5 distinct layers, and we're going to talk about each one of those in detail, but you can just see right here, it starts right down here on the bottom, and notice how it has that kind of wavy appearance here. We'll talk about why in a minute. But then it goes up. So this very first layer right here is called the stratum boselli. The second layer here is going to be called the stratum spinosum. Then you have the stratum granulosum, and then you have the stratum lucidum, which we rarely see, and then finally the stratum corneum. So let's talk about each one of those layers in a little bit more detail. We'll start first with the stratum boselli, and no, that is not the redneck pronunciation. It really is stratum boselli. It's not stratum basal. But basically, this sits on top of the dermis, so it's the layer that's closest to the blood supply that's coming from underneath the dermis, because remember, there's no vascularization in the epidermis. it's going to be therefore the most active of all the cell layers. These are simple cuboidal cells, and most of them are kind of sitting on this little wavy row here. So you've got a single wavy row of cells, and what they're doing is there's lots of stem cells here that are producing or having a lot of mitosis going on. So that keeps you a constant supply and pushes cells upward. And then we'll just go into the different layers as we go up. But you start with a stratum basal. 90% of these cells are the keratinocytes. You also have some of the melanocytes. We've already talked about them. With the melanocytes, we said that they synthesize melanin and produce that. That is what gives skin its color. Well, what makes the differences in people's skin color? Do some people have more melanocytes than others? No. We all have the same number of melanocytes. It's just that some melanocytes produce more or produce larger granules of pigment, and so that makes the skin darker. Albinos, who have very little skin pigmentation, they lack the ability to produce melanin, so their skin is very pale. All right. The next layer is the stratum spinosum, and these cells contain a lot of RNA because they're involved in the synthesis of keratin, that tough protein that forms that waxy, waterproof layer. So they've got a lot of activity going on in the way of protein synthesis. It's called spinosum because it kind of has a spiny appearance. The cells look like those, big balls that, I don't know, like cavemen. Who throws those big balls? That's really a bad drawing, but y'all get the idea. The big spike balls I'm talking about. But anyway, they kind of look like that on a slide. Now, in real life, they don't look like that at all. What happens is these cells have junctions called desmosomes, and these are adherence junctions where they hold them together with the other cells that are joined to them. And as you prepare these slides, the cell kind of pulls away, but those desmosomes hold tight. So everywhere you have a desmosome, that's going to give you a little spiky appearance here, and it'll be kind of clear in this area here. But anyway, that's not real life. In real life, these cells are held together in real tight junctions by these desmosomes. And that's essential because that tight junction between the cells, that's what causes the waterproofing nature, because you don't want leaky stuff getting through here. So you want each cell to be bound to the next cell in a very tight junction, and that's what that desmosome does. You may also see some melanin pigments in these, or melanin granules in these cells in this layer, but they're primarily just these keratinocytes. All right, the next layer is the stratum granulosum. And remember, we're going up. So we started down here with the stratum basal. Then we had the next layer is the stratum spinosum. And then now we're going up further to the surface. The surface would be up here of our skin. So that, let's just put this is going to be the outside. The next layer up would be the stratum granulosum. It contains about 3 to 5 layers of cells, and there's lots of keratin in these, or keratin granules in these cells. That's why it's called granulosum, because you can actually see the little keratin granules within these cells. These cells are getting further away from the dermis. Remember, the blood supply is going to be down here in the dermis, and so these cells are starting to die. There's lots of lysosomes that contain hydrolytic enzymes that start chewing up and eating up the cell parts, the organelles and stuff that we're not going to be using anymore because these cells are dying. So basically, these cells are just full of keratin granules, and everything else is starting to get eaten up. The next layer, well, before I leave that, also the plasma membrane of these stratum granulosum cells is starting to thicken up. So what you're ending up with is just thick bags of keratin. That's what the cell becomes. All right, then you go to this next layer, the stratum lucidum, which would be right there. And you're rarely going to see this layer in the lab on slide preparations. It represents more of a transitional layer between the stratum granulosum and the stratum corneum, that next layer up. It's only seen in thick skin, and it's called stratum lucidum because when you do see it, it just appears as this little clear layer, and that's what lucid means, clear. But you probably will never see it, so don't get real hung up on that one. And then finally you have the stratum corneum, and that's just a bunch of flattened squamous cells. There's no cytoplasm, there's no organelles. Basically all you have left is keratin and the plasma membrane. Remember that keratin is going to waterproof the skin and form a physical barrier. Now, this physical barrier that we call the stratum corneum can be several layers thick, but it's shed. And as it's shed, you know it as dandruff. It flakes off. You have dry skin, it flakes off. And this is a wonderful thing if you're like a dust mite. It provides lots of food for you. So you get dust mites in your bed and on your furniture, and then that's what they eat, is your little dead skin cells. So isn't that nice to know? All right. I mentioned thick skin and thin skin. If you look here on this slide, thick skin, now this epidermis is going from here all the way up to the top here. That's going to be epidermis. And again, from here to, well, it's not even showing the other part, but this is all going to, oops, go back. Sorry about that. This is all going to be your dermis. What has happened to my pen? I'm going wacko here. Hang on. I love computers. They make me so happy. Okay, I got my pen back. Sorry about that. This is your dermis right here. So this is your epidermis right in here. Okay, well notice the difference in this thick skin. You've got this thick stratum corneum layer right here. And in the thin skin, you just have your little bitty thin stratum corneum right there. So this would be your epidermal layer from here up, and then this would all be your dermal layer down here. So it's that stratum corneum, that final layer, that actually makes the skin thick or thin skin. Thick or thin, I don't know what I just said. You know the meaning of it anyway, I hope. All right, next thing. All right, your next layer that we want to talk about is the dermis. So again, right here, epidermis is this top layer. That's your stratum corneum right there that flakes off, and that's what you touch when you touch your skin. But then you have the dermis, which is going to be this layer right here, from there to there. It sits right under the epidermis, and it binds to the epidermis. And if you look here, you see how it binds in kind of a wavy function? See all these little waves? That's to prevent the epidermis from sliding and slipping across the dermis. So it makes these little dips, and that gives you a good connection between the dermis and the epidermis. These little folds that you see are actually called dermal papilla. Oops, didn't mean to write that out. So when you have these little folds like that, those are called dermal papilla. So it's actually dermis that is dipping into the epidermis. So there's your epidermis up here. Here's your dermis right there. So it's a little dermis pushing up into the epidermis. And these little things we call epidermal fold, or excuse me, dermal papilla right there, those little folds. Now, if you're looking from the top down, from the epidermis down, you could call that an epidermal ridge. So that's just looking at it from the top down, you're going to call that an epidermal ridge. But if you're looking from the dermis up, you're going to call this an epidermal papilla, or these little finger-like projections that stick up in here. Most of your dermis is composed of this thick, dense, irregular connective tissue. It's going to contain nerve cell processes, blood vessels, hair follicles. It's going to have glands in it. You're going to have the oily sebaceous glands. You'll have your sweat glands. You'll have some muscle in here. You've got the erector pili muscle, which you'll learn more about later on, that actually pulls your hair on your arms and stuff to stand up when you have like goosebumps, and you'll learn all about that. But let's look a little bit more in detail about the dermis. Again, it's going to be from here down to this. This is adipose tissue in here, so this is going to be your hypodermis. And this dense, thick, irregular connective tissue, that's going to be your dermis. And then everything up here is going to be your epidermis. Okay? You can divide the dermis into two distinct layers. Where you have these little dermal papilla right in here, where all these little bumps go up in here, that, we kind of outline that out, and we call that the papillary layer. So that's where the dermal papilla are, in the papillary layer. So that would be your first layer, that papillary layer. Again, it's projections of the dermis up into the epidermis. And that just makes a nice tight connection so the dermis and epidermis don't slip around on each other. The bulk of the dermis is this reticular layer right here. So all of this actually would be your reticular layer. And there's it written out nice and neat so you can read the writing. This has many elastic fibers that run through. It also has a lot of collagen fibers. The elastic fibers provide kind of some stretchiness, so you can, when the skin is stretched, it will pop back into shape. The collagen provides strength so that the skin doesn't get damaged. But if you have damage to either the elastic or the collagen fibers, you're going to end up with something like wrinkles or stretch marks. So as you age, unfortunately, you do get some damage just naturally. The hypodermis is going to begin down here, I said, with the adipose tissue. So let's talk a little bit more about that. Hypodermis is also known as subcutaneous layer. You can call them either one. I like to use hypodermis because that just tells me hypo. It's under the dermis, and that just kind of gives me an idea of where it is. But you notice on here, it's all this little fat layer, this adipose tissue. That's how you recognize it. This fat or adipose tissue has several functions. The first thing is it's going to provide insulation. That's going to be thermal insulation, so it keeps you warm and it keeps your body temperature right. This adipose also provides energy storage. Remember, fat cells store energy, so that gives us a good supply. So if you're in a situation where you're starving, you start using your adipose for energy, and you can stay alive. It also provides protection. Adipose provides a nice soft cushion. Some of us have more cushion than others. It also makes like female skin soft and curvy and gives that kind of appearance to it, but it is there for protection. You're also going to see a lot of major blood vessels found in the hypodermic or hypodermis or the subcutaneous layer. And this provides a good route for administering medications. You've heard of a hypodermic needle, or when you go and get a shot, and they stick the needle down and they go straight all the way through your skin into this layer right here, that hypodermic layer. Then you can just let the medicine get picked up by these numerous blood vessels that are flowing through this layer. It avoids you having to take medicine orally, because sometimes medicine will make your stomach upset and things like that. It's quicker to get it to your bloodstream than if you took the medicine orally. So that just provides a good route for administering medication. You're going to talk a whole lot more about some of this in in your lab class, and your teachers will need to go over like the hair follicles and all of the glands, the sebaceous glands and the different glands that you find in the dermal regions. But for now, we'll see you later. That's all.